All right, I am back here on the Just End of Suffering podcast, getting ready to talk some college football today. Season's coming up a couple of weeks. Joining me today, somebody who heard the podcast before. He covers college football for the Sporting News. Bill Bender is here again. Bill, how are you?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Not a problem. I have to say, I know the season's coming up. I feel like all the buzz around the sport now is about this realignment that started with Oklahoma and Texas moving to the SEC from the Big 12. Like, what's your takeaway been from the start of what appears to be another cycle of realignment?
Well, I mean, obviously it's been the focus. Normally at this time of year, I'm ready to start talking about games and those kind of things, but realignment certainly has taken center stage. We'll see if it continues. I think, some of the other leagues could kind of take a wait and see approach. I know the thing about it was the two biggest prizes of the realignment wheel were taken. So it's really, I think everything else is going to come down to what the Big 12 does next.
Yeah, it makes some sense because I feel like there's still 8 schools in there. I feel like the logical move for them would be just to raid the American to try and pick up some schools. But at the same time, you wonder if how many of the members are going to start looking for greener pastures like the Big 10 or the Pac-12.
For sure. And I think that's what we're kind of waiting on to see what happens next. And once there's some clarity on what the Big 12's next move is, then maybe we end up with 4 super conferences. Maybe we end up with college football as is, but kind of a 4-2-4 setup in terms of the Big 12 kind of becomes a bridge between the power conferences and the group of 5 conferences, a lot like the American Athletic Conference is now.
Yeah, that makes some sense. I feel like the other big thing to impact the college football this season is the NIL legislation. And we've seen a lot of these guys starting to get endorsements. I think it's great, but how do you think it'll impact the sport this year? Do you think anything we'll know is just like minor things that we're not going to pay any attention to?
Well, I mean, it's obviously going to impact the sport. I mean, there's a lot going on with NIL. And I think it's one of those deals where a lot of it has come up really fast. I mean, we've already seen a quarterback not play his senior season in Quinn Ewers to go to Ohio State and not necessarily be guaranteed playing time as a freshman. So at the truly elite level, it matters. And I think along the way, as long as these endorsement deals are done on a case-by-case basis and they're on the up, that it's not going to harm the sport too much.
Yeah, I think so. I think the one thing that can harm the sport right now based on what's going on in this country is unfortunately COVID again, where we're in a better spot than we were a year ago where we weren't even sure if we were going to have a season. But it feels like right now, the thing I'm curious about watching is see what's going to happen with some of these schools, especially if like some athletes chose not to get the vaccine, what kind of protocols they got to follow.
It's getting real. It is. I mean, obviously with the Delta variant and everything that comes with that, teams are emphasizing high vaccine rates. Teams are emphasizing that there's not the built-in schedule flexibility that there may have been in the past. So knowing both of those things, I think it's something that we're going to keep in mind as we move forward. Hopefully it doesn't get too out of hand. I know, the best thing you can do is it's not really, I'm not making a political statement. I think from a strictly football standpoint, the best thing to do is to get vaccinated, make sure that you're as safe as possible so we can have these games on the field with limited interruptions.
Yeah, let's talk about some of the games on the field right now. I want to start with Alabama, who won the national title last year. A lot of the big names are gone, but they are still probably the favorite to be number 1 in the preseason poll. What do you think about Alabama's chances of winning yet another title?
Well, I mean, it's a new supporting cast, and I would never say Alabama's vulnerable because they have so much talent, but even Nick Saban said they're going to be a work in progress. So, the early season schedule, games against Miami, Florida, Texas A&M on October 9th, I think we'll know where they're at. But certainly a lot of talent returns. Bryce Young, 5-star quarterback, Brian Robinson at running back, Mechie at receiver. I think their defense could be a strength early in the season with guys like Christian Wilson, Will Anderson, and then Henry Teoto. I hope I got that right. It's Teoto. And the Tennessee transfer linebacker with a tricky last name, but a very good player as well.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously, playing at SC even before Oklahoma and Texas get there is not going to be easy. But who's going to think in that league give them the most of a challenge, the most tough time?
Well, that's a tough one. I think Texas A&M seems positioned to do that, and they've got a lot of good players. But they've got a quarterback question as well. So you go from there, and then you look at maybe is it LSU? A lot of talent coming back on their roster. Is it Florida? I would say the answer is Georgia. And you know what? I was kind of tempted to pick Georgia to win the SEC based on what they have coming back with JT Daniels, the way they rated the transfer portal, strong defense coming back. But we almost need to see them beat Alabama to believe it at this point, because Georgia's had the talent. They've had the talent the last 3 years.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's something you want to watch with them for sure. And the other big giant down south trying to make a run at the national title is Clemson, which obviously whole new world for them. No Trevor Lawrence anymore. Travis Etienne went pro. So what does life look like without Trevor Lawrence for Clemson?
Well, I think they're going to be pretty good. I think Clemson's got a chance to really prove themselves after back-to-back playoff losses. LSU, Ohio State last year. But here we go again. DJ Uiagalelei is a good place to start. He played well in the 2 starts he was in, and they've got really good running backs around him. Justin Ross returns. I think that defense, much like Alabama, going to be better with guys like Brian Bresee and the depth that they have on the defensive line. Skalski returned at linebacker. So, I mean, they're the team to beat in the ACC as usual.
Yeah, I would think so. And I think the other league I think is interesting is always the Big Ten, because usually Ohio State goes, but I don't think they're as strong as they've been in recent years. Do you think that somebody can push them for that top spot? Because I feel like right now they might be a league that has trouble getting somebody in the playoff if the top of their league doesn't step up.
No, I think the talent's stable in Ohio State's just fine. They do have a question at quarterback, obviously, with C.J. Stroud stepping in, and anytime you have a guy come in that has never thrown a pass at the college level, makes it interesting. I mentioned Quinn Ewers earlier. You wonder if he'll be a factor at some point. But their receiver room is ridiculous with Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, with the guys behind them. There's 4 or 5, maybe 6 first-round picks in that receiver room alone, and then they have depth on the defensive side too. So I think the talent gap between Ohio State and everybody else in the Big Ten is still very considerable. Sorry if this doesn't make for good podcast material, but I mean, when you're looking at the big boys, right, it's Clemson, it's Alabama, and it's Ohio State, and it's hard to pick anybody else in those conferences.
Yeah, I don't blame you, because I mean, you look at that receiver room you mentioned for Ohio State. That sounds like the Alabama receiver where they're sending guys to the first round every single year, right? This might become Ohio State now, getting all these guys drafted to the pros.
Yeah, I mean, they've got a really good teams. So, and it's about developing that NFL talent. And those 3 schools have been able to do it as good as anyone. So I guess the real question is, can anyone in those conferences step up? I think Penn State might have a bounce back year in the Big Ten. I like North Carolina where they're at as a program. Do I think they're ready for Clemson? We'll see. I mean, they're the only one on the field other than Notre Dame on a 1-year basis that has really challenged Clemson in the ACC on the field. So, and it's 2 years later with Sam Howell. So I really like where they're going, but it really is tough to pick anybody else.
Yeah, it is. I think the other league to watch out for the playoffs, probably the Big 12, because you have Oklahoma, who's always pretty good, and Iowa State's coming along and becoming a big threat in the Big 12. So if you were to look at this league right now, do you think Oklahoma or Iowa State's the favorite?
Well, I think Oklahoma's the favorite. Again, Spencer Rattler, loaded offense, 6 straight that they've won. I mean, that's ridiculous. And they do, but to your point, Iowa State's the one team that's beat them twice. They've shown they can play with them on the field. And they had everybody come back. Brock Purdy, Breece Hall, Mike Rose, Charlie Kohler. That's 3 of those guys are SM preseason All-Americans. So Matt Campbell definitely has established a really good culture. I think they're going to be able to compete. And the added factor here that has just come up in the last month is, what if this is the last year that Oklahoma and Texas are in the ACC or Big 12, and then the SEC kind of pushes it up and gets them in that league next year? This farewell tour will have a lot of animosity in places like Oklahoma State, where Oklahoma plays, and Baylor, where Texas plays. It's going to be a lot of fun.
I think it's a fascinating year for Iowa State, too, because their team has not always been great. They're on the way up, and you wonder, with the state of the Big 12, maybe this is an audition for them and say, hey, we have another big year. Maybe we catch the Big Ten's eye, because they're a good fit in that geographic footprint of the league.
That could be an audition for Matt Campbell, too. I mean, a lot of people have tried to link him to the Michigan job if Jim Harbaugh doesn't work out. Iowa State, perfectly reasonable thing there. They're going to have the highest preseason ranking they've ever had. The expectations are through the roof. They are a really talented team, but this is the same program that lost to Louisiana in September last season. So, and they got to play Iowa, and that's a school that I believe they've only beat once under Matt Campbell. and Iowa's feeling pretty good about where they're at. So they are that kind of X-factor team out of the Big 12 that I'm really watching closely, not just for the season, but everything you just mentioned as well.
Yeah, we already talked about Iowa State. The other sleeper teams you're watching this year you think can make some noise, not necessarily the playoff, but sort of do better than what people think they will.
Well, I mean, Iowa State, North Carolina kind of jump out to me. It's a big year for Penn State. I think Oregon and USC out of the Pac-12. We've gotten this far. I haven't really talked about that conference, but Oregon's quietly loaded. Got a really good quarterback. Well, quarterback's question mark with Anthony Brown, but we know he has talent. They've got great skill position players. They got Kayvon Thibodeau leading that defense. He's a future top 3, maybe even number 1 pick, and they get a big spotlight game against Ohio State to start the season. So, yeah, I mean, they're certainly a team that we're keeping an eye on. And USC has recruited a little better the last couple cycles, and they have Keaton Slovis at quarterback. So both of those teams feel really good about where they're at.
Yeah, Oregon says it's interesting because obviously the Pac-12 is not got the same level of national attention as the other leagues do. But if they can win that game against Ohio State, and they can go, I think if they go undefeated, I think they're in. But I think one loss and they have Ohio State win, it's going to be hard for the committee to say keep them out.
Well, yeah, and it's for sure. And as long as they acquit themselves well there and then go win the Pac-12, they'll have a chance. And so they're kind of the one program that really has a chance to get back on the national spotlight. And it's been a long climb back since being in the national championship game in 2014 with that team that had Marcus Mariota. But Oregon, right there. And they're the other team that's kind of, if you're picking off the normal 4, which, full disclosure, Sporting News picked Oklahoma, Alabama, Clemson, and Ohio State to reach the playoff. But you're always looking for that little bit of excitement to come around and hopefully jazz up the season a little bit.
Yeah, I know that right now there is talk that the expansion to the playoff is coming. I think would be good because obviously you can almost write in the 4 teams before the season even starts. So, what do you think about that coming down the pipe? We're going to get 8 or 12 down the line.
Well, I think 12 is the most inclusive plan, and now we're kind of in wait and see what happens with the Big 12. Because think about it, if they let 6 conference champions in, the Big 12 could theoretically sit back and say, hey, we're good, and get an Oklahoma State in the playoff every year. And if it's really about that. So I think that's all remains to be seen. The 12-team playoff will help, and it'll be the most inclusive format possible. It will hopefully, get the quarterfinals, not just the first round, but the quarterfinals on campus, and really generate some enthusiasm for a sport that, I'm trying to sound as excited as I am, but part of me, the difference between the NFL and college football, if you look at the NFL right now, and there's double-digit teams that can go into this season and at least have a Super Bowl expectation. I don't know if you can say the same about college football right now outside of one hand's worth of teams, maybe 4 or 5, that can truly think that they can play for a national championship.
Yeah, I do think the playoff will help eventually down the line, as you basically laid out the 4 that are already in there. And I think, if you go a future here where we have the Power 5 all send their teams in, 1 from the group of 5, and then the best of the rest, you have a great chance of producing upset. That's more games that these teams like Alabama or Ohio State actually have to win. Yeah,
and I think that's what makes it so exciting. And that's down the line. They've got a couple years to knock all that out, and this was a summer of change. I know last year was a summer of uncertainty with COVID and everything that came with that, and whether or not they were going to play. This one's been quite the opposite. So much has happened, and we may look back at 2020 and say that was the year that changed it all, and in some ways it already has been.
Yeah, do you think this could be something where the realignment wheel and the roller coaster, the carousel, kind of delays this playoff? I think it's going to kind of be in 2025, what they've been talking about after the current deal expires.
Well, I mean, yeah, maybe, but, everything's fluid right now. I just kind of go off what Kirk Ferentz said at Big Ten Media Day, that you can't rule anything out. Never say never. Never say it. When I get on Twitter and somebody says, well, so-and-so will never join this conference, I kind of chuckle because when I was 14 years old, and if somebody would have told me, hey, when you're 40, Oklahoma is going to be in the SEC and Nebraska is going to be in the Big Ten, I'd have said you're crazy. And that's where we're at. So, I mean, any change is possible. A lot of it's driven by money and TV, and that'll probably dictate the flow of what happens next.
Yeah, that's for sure. The last thing I want to ask is obviously going into the year, the Heisman, I feel like every year there seems to be a front runner. We haven't really had the front runner win the last few years. Who are some guys you think could be Heisman candidates this year?
Well, it's the usuals. I mean, like a Spencer Rattler, DJ Uiagalelei. We talked about him earlier. Sam Howell, North Carolina. He puts up monster numbers, and if they somehow win the ACC, he'll have a chance. It is typically a quarterback award. Outside of that, it gets tough to see. I mean, I don't know if a receiver can do it again, unless like a guy like Olave or Garrett Wilson has a ridiculous year. Maybe Marvin Mims at Oklahoma. And then running back wise, like a deep sleeper would be Bijan Robinson, the Texas running back, based on the fact he averaged 8.2 yards per carry. And I think Steve Sarkisian will get the most of them, much like he got out of Najee Harris, who scored 50 total touchdowns at Alabama the last 2 seasons and still didn't win the award.
Absolutely. Bill, thanks for all the time. I really appreciate it. Before I let you go, how can you follow social media, keep up with your coverage over the sporting news?
Yeah, we'll have plenty of preseason coverage here over the next few weeks. I'm at Bill Bender 92. Really enjoy what I do over here, and getting closer and closer to football. It's been a lot of fun.
It is a lot of fun. Looking forward to watching the season. Bill, thanks for all the time. I appreciate it.
Hey, no problem. Thanks for having me.